Hello, guys. Welcome to the show. My guest today is a visual effects, originally a visual effects um, designer, and then he went on to be supervisor of the model unit, connected with Doctor Who, from the classic series onto the relaunch in 2005. He overlapped both, which is quite unique. And he's also a writer, and he's done many things. So I'd like to welcome, please, Mike Tucker. How are you, Mike?
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Frank.
Great.
Very good.
Lovely. Mike, first thing I'd like to ask you is, how did you get started in the business?
Um, I always had an interest in model making, whether that was Airfix kits or Meccano or Lego. And I was always an artistic kid drawing stuff. So I always knew that that's where I wanted to go, something that allowed me to use that interest. And originally, I'd hoped that I would get into the museum business. I was fascinated by in the big museums in Cardiff and London, there were these dioramas, little windows into prehistoric worlds or historical, all done forced perspective. And I really wanted to be somebody who did that. And then there was a day when I was watching daytime television with my parents, a BBC show called Pebble Mill at One. And they were interviewing Bernard Wilkie and Jack Kine from the BBC's visual effects department. I think they were promoting Blake Seven, and suddenly it became apparent to me that there was this world where you wouldn't just build the models, but you would film those models and make them move and stuff. And that became my focus very much. So that's when I went, oh, I'd love to join the BBC's visual effects department. And I'd been a fan of Doctor Who and, the Jerry and Sylvia Anderson shows like Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet. But I guess at that point, the sort of mass of behind the scenes stuff that you now get on DVDs and Blu-rays and making of programs wasn't really as wide ranging as it is now. So finding information was tricky. But once I'd found this focus, that's when I decided that's what I want to do. And I had both parents and school teachers and friends who were very supportive. And a neighbour of mine back in Swansea said, well, I know the head of the visual effects department, so I'll see if I can arrange a meeting. So I went along and I was shown around the effects department when I was in my teens. So yeah, I mean, this career path has been sort of building for a while, and I'm very lucky in that it came to fruition, and I did get into the BBC effects department in my 20s.
Fantastic. Yeah. Um, so of the other productions pre-Doctor Who, I mean, that you worked on, I mean, you've worked on an awful lot. I was looking at some of the list of the stuff you've done. Um, but rather than me go through a list, rather ask you what productions that you worked on stood out for you. What gave you the most sort of joy at the time?
Well, it's always interesting because people assume that the science fiction shows are the largest part of my career. And the truth is they're not. They come around very seldom. It's just that they're the ones that everyone latches onto because they're the obvious vehicle for effects.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Doctor Who and Red Dwarf were delightful things to work on. And childhood ambitions realized in Doctor Who, and Red Dwarf turned into a far bigger vehicle for us than we ever could have hoped when it started. But yeah, I mean, 90% of the shows I do have been documentaries and things like Horizon
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
999 International. And I've been very lucky in that my career took me sort of in the direction of a lot of very big what they used to call docudramas, so dramatized documentaries about real historical events. So Pompeii, Krakatoa, Hiroshima, you
Oh
know.
yeah. Yeah.
So that's been where the bulk of my work has come from. And those are the shows that have really challenged me. So weirdly, it's non-fiction stuff that has given me the biggest buzz over the years. Just trying to recreate these cataclysmic events in a way that sort of allows you to be both cinematic and exciting for the audience, but respectful of the fact that an awful lot of people may have lost their livelihoods and lives in these events. So straddling that balance of not making the effects cheesy was always a challenge, but at the same time being very well aware that you were doing these big effects driven sequences. And Discovery Channel and the BBC and ITV did a lot of these. They're less popular these days because they're quite expensive to make.
Oh
So
yeah,
it's a
yeah,
lot easier to do something like Mythbusters or
yeah.
Bangers and Cash, these very reality driven shows. But I rode a wave of when these were very popular. And then going back to the beginning of my career, I was at the BBC at a time when we were making hundreds, if not thousands, of programs. Last of the Summer Wine, Top of the Pops, Tomorrow's World, The
Yeah.
Crankies, all of these shows, and you did get to work on everything. So it was a fantastic training ground.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all these different genres and stuff. Yeah. Um, so when did you start? I think I read something about you working on the. I seem to remember these documentaries about and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, if it's the one I'm thinking of, to do with the dinosaurs walking the earth. There was
Yeah, it was a
and they
big
used a
discovery.
sort of early CGI on with the dinosaurs. Is that the one you worked on?
No,
Uh,
dinosaur shows, I think, sort of turned a corner when Walking with Dinosaurs came on the BBC.
yes.
That's
Yeah.
when the CG caught up with, well, not caught up. TV had been struggling to sort of afford CG like that. Walking with Dinosaurs was a bit of a groundbreaker. But no, the show I worked on was a show called Last Day of the Dinosaurs, which was a 90-minute Discovery Channel narrated documentary which I did for a company called Dangerous Films. The CG was handled by a digital effects company in Canada. But Tim Goodchild, who was the producer and art director, was very keen to ground that CG in real environments wherever possible. So we started by just giving them an awful lot of elements like mud splashes and rain and leaves falling constantly. He wanted this forest to feel alive. So we just shot leaves against blue screen. So all this stuff got comped into the CG backgrounds. But on top of that, there were a number of key sequences that he felt could be achieved in camera. So we did puppet dinosaurs in miniature sets. And then it was normally when there was a big destructive event. So one sequence was like a firestorm raging through a forest, one was a tidal wave, one was an earthquake. So we were then working very closely with the CG company to make sure that our actual physical miniatures were matching their digital assets. So a lot of back and forth between that, making sure the lighting matched. And then on top of that, we shot an awful lot of cloud tank work, which is a very sort of old-fashioned technique used a lot on films like Raiders of the Lost Ark and Close Encounters and Flash Gordon to create these very, very almost unreal skies. So we shot an awful lot of cloud tank work, which were dropped into the CG backgrounds as well. So what you ended up on screen was a real mix of practical and digital effects,
Yeah.
which is lovely. That's great for both the audience and the effects practitioners because everyone's got some ownership of the scene, but it does require a lot of coordination and both sides respecting each other's crafts. But yeah, lovely show to do, and again, a non-sci-fi show, but because of my love of Ray Harryhausen films to do. I mean, we did a puppet Triceratops in a forest.
Yeah.
I was delighted.
Yeah, that must have been great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so how did you get involved with working on Doctor Who? Is it mostly an in-house thing that happens? And it's like, oh,
Yeah.
this guy will you sort of transition that way, or do you have to have an interview, or how does it work?
Well, the BBC's special effects department was a permanent in-house facility, so the job there was permanent. I joined as a trainee. I did a couple of months training. Then you start interviewing for the permanent places. because I mean, I joined the BBC in '85, and at which point there were over 100 people working at the effects department. So I mean, that's office staff, support staff, the stores, and plus the designers and the assistants. So it was one of the largest, if not the largest, permanent television visual effects company in the world. And every year they took on about 6 or 7 new trainees, and then assistants got made up to designer, or people retired at the top end. So you were constantly joining an ability to get a permanent job there. So I got made permanent. And you were basically allocated as an assistant to whichever designer needed assistance that week. So that would be things like Top of the Pops when you were new, because you learned how to operate the dry ice and smoke machines. You learned how to deal with the etiquette of going into a studio and how you interacted with other departments like set, costume, and lighting. And then I was allocated to things like Tomorrow's World. And then once the managers there sort of got to realize that my talents were model making and prop making, as opposed to, you know, engineering or welding, because we had people running the gamut of this, it was, okay, you start getting pushed towards shows that require more model making and prop making skills. So I worked with Matt Irvin on a kids show called Galloping Galaxies. And at the time, Doctor Who was off the air. It was this gap. It was the Trial of a Time Lord season hadn't started, but so I thought I'd missed my opportunity on Doctor Who. But towards the end of my first 6-month batch with the BBC, I suddenly noticed that Doctor Who was back again. And I just made a request to the management. I said, I've not done a science fiction show since I've been here. I like prop and model making. Is there any chance I can get onto it? And so I was allocated to Mike Kelt, who was the effects designer for the first 4 episodes of Trial of a Time Lord. And he went, yeah, okay, we need models of the Tardis built because they've gone missing during the 18-month hiatus. So I want one about that big and one about that big. Off you go. And that's my first job. So, you know, I got launched into the deep end, if you like. And then the following year, Colin had been dismissed and Sylvester was the new Doctor. And I got to work on Sylvester's first story. And that just started a run of me working sort of on 3 stories a year, alternating my work on Doctor Who with the early seasons of Red Dwarf. So suddenly I had a lot of science fiction sort of coming onto my lap, which was fantastic.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. So what particular stories of that you worked on in classic Doctor Who were very memorable for you, and also what were the sort of challenges you faced working on those particular stories as well?
Sylvester's first story, Time of the Rani, which I know is not well regarded by fans, but from the effects point of view, it's fantastic. It had model work shot on film. It had foreground miniatures done on location. It had this fantastic blend of traditional model making and prop making effects with the new video effects work that was coming in. So I had 2 very, very experienced designers that I was working with. Colin Mapson, who'd been an effects designer on the show going back to Pertwee's era, and Dave Chapman, who'd been the video effects supervisor. And the bubble traps, where Bonnie Langford's in this spinning electronic bubble bouncing off the location, was an incredible learning curve for all of us. And to be at the forefront of that when it was being done was very exciting. But at the same time, although my model making was fine, and I did the lovely model of the Rani Citadel, which was a lovely job to do, I was incredibly green in terms of location filming and things. And I do remember being in a quarry, as you are with Doctor Who, filming this stuff in the hammering rain. thinking, I'm completely not prepared for this, and the speed with which you had to get stuff made. So a real throw you in at the deep end and see if you can sink or swim. And Colin, my designer, was very smart in that he had myself and a colleague, Russell, who'd both joined very recently. And backing those up, he had two very experienced and long-standing effects designer assistants, Len Hutton and Roger Barham. So he always knew that he had this enthusiasm that he could tap onto, but the experience of two older effects assistants to rely on, and it worked very well. It was good for all of us, and it's a favorite story because of that. As I said, I think the visuals look fantastic.
The bubble trap thing was fascinating to me, how that was done. Yeah, I'm glad you sort of spoke about that, how that effect was realized, you know.
Yeah, and it starts to point to the way that things were going to move, you know, that it was this digital technology that was going to start grabbing hold of effect sequences and moving them forwards. I mean, they tried in that story to do a full CG sequence at the beginning of the Tardis spinning through space. Now, I think the CG is incredibly crude in that sequence. It does not hold up. But at least we were trying, and we were starting to sort of push at the boundaries of where does one discipline bump up against the other. And of course, once the show came back in 2005, those two disciplines were absolutely smushed side by side.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, but before we get to that, Mike, you know, you coming back to the new series when it came back in 2005. You have a career also in writing.
Yes.
So when did you decide to become a writer? What this is another sort of string to your bow.
I'd always wanted to do it. I'd always wanted to be a writer. As a kid, I was always writing with my friends, Doctor Who films, Doctor Who comic strips. You know, we had a little Super 8 club at school where we were making our own films. So the storytelling aspect of it's always been there, and I've always been a reader. You can probably tell. So it was always something I wanted to do. Wouldn't it be great? And what gave me the opportunity was that once Doctor Who had gone off the air, Sophie Aldred and I were chatting about, we'd got all these lovely stories about the making of Sylvester's era and all these photographs of us making Sylvester's era. So we pitched a book to Virgin Books, who had the license at the time, and that was the Ace book, the inside story of the end of an era. So we did a behind the scenes book. And that meant I suddenly had access to an editor and a publishing house via a somewhat, you know, backdoor route. And when we were in production on that book, I said to my editor, Rebecca Levine, I know that you're doing the Missing Adventures and the New Adventures. Is there any chance of me pitching something? And fair dues to Rebecca. She said, well, you've got no track record in fiction whatsoever, but we do a series of short stories called Decalogue. So I wrote a short story with my writing partner, Robert Perry, for Decalogue 2. So at that point, I suddenly had a non-fiction title with my name on it and a fiction title with my name in it. And once you've got a published story, it makes it a lot easier to pitch to the next batch of people. So when Virgin lost the license, and it's not, I mean, I did pitch an awful lot of stories at Rebecca over the years, Robert and I, to try and get New Adventures, and we never managed it. And then when the BBC took back the license in 96, I think it was, after the McGann film, I pitched again, and they went, oh, we love this. Great. You know, you're on board. You'll be one of the 6 launch titles. And that was Illegal Alien. And it's the same process. Once you have access to a publishing house and an editor, and you've had a book published, you're on a list of people that they invite to pitch again. And so that just managed to roll along. and it's been lovely. I mean, it's been something that's just sat alongside my effects career, and I've managed to expand it beyond just Doctor Who. You know, I've been able to write for the Merlin range. I've done some work for Oxford University Press's child literacy schemes. I've done a couple of Star Cops audio books for Big Finish. So, you know, it's allowed me to sort of spread my wings a little bit, which has been nice. But like my effects career, Doctor Who is always there as this thread that comes through it all.
So how did you get to meet? How did that come about? You meeting Robert Perry and working jointly on books.
We were at school together. We were
Ah,
the same
right.
year at school.
Yeah.
So Robert and I sort of bumped into each other. Just 1 year, I think I overheard him talking about Doctor Who in the corridor. We got chatting, and it's very strange because this is a big comprehensive school in Swansea in South Wales, and a year ahead of us, or 2 years ahead of us in school, was a gentleman called Russell T Davis. So there's a lot of us in that particular school who were Doctor Who fans who've sort of gone on in some shape or form to be involved in it, which has been lovely.
Small world, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, he hasn't done too bad for himself either, has he?
No, he's
Really?
done
No.
okay. He's done okay.
um, uh, so you've written audio adventures as well, haven't you? For
Yeah.
but both the BBC or audio stories for the BBC and also full cast stuff for Big Finish. Um, is there a particular challenge from writing a novel, as it were, the description, the things in a novel, compared to writing scripts for audio? I mean, what did you find that a particularly difficult
Yeah, I
change
mean,
in any way?
there are restrictions within audio because um, I'm not a huge fan of the characters standing there and describing what they're looking at. I find that a very clumsy way of doing it. But um, audio, you are forced in some ways to try and get the information that you would normally get across visually in a different way. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend I didn't knock heads with script editors occasionally, me wanting to do it one way and then wanting to do it another. But I found writing for Sophie and Sylvester very, very easy because I'd worked with them so extensively, and I'd written for them in prose quite extensively. So actually getting a handle on their dialogue, I found relatively easy. So I had, if you like, an easy in onto audio drama by writing characters I knew really, really well. But yeah, I mean, I still say I probably struggle with audio scripts more than I do with prose writing. It's a harder discipline.
Yeah, they're very yeah. There's definitely challenges from both. Well, for both really.
Yeah,
Because I find writing very very difficult. You know, I've tried to write things, but oh man, it's a discipline that I don't really, you know, to sit down and make time to write so X amount of words or pages or whatever. Um,
but
is
sometimes
I,
it's funny. I mean,
uh,
I'm very, if things aren't going well, then yeah, it's to sit down and actually try and get 500 or 1,000 words out, impossible. If things are going really well, then I can double that easily. I mean, the worst I've ever had in terms of, an impossible or seemingly impossible deadline is one of the Merlin books I did. I was suddenly sprung on me that on a Friday afternoon, they needed the finished manuscript on Monday, and I had 17,000 words to go. So I wrote 17,000 words in a weekend. They're not the best 17,000 words I've ever written, and I benefited from the fact that I was adapting an existing screenplay, not coming up with. But even so, that's a long word count for 2 days. But I did it because that's what deadlines force you to do. You're forced to hit them. But what I'm finding on a slightly more relaxed deadline is something Terrance Dicks said, Doctor Who writer from the classic era. He said, never stop at the end of a working day without knowing what the first line you're going to write the following day is. He said, never reach the end of a chapter or a cliffhanger and go bang. Always know where you're going, because he said otherwise you have to get that start up again. Whereas if you know what your first line is, that will flow into the next one and the next one, and it gets you going again. And it's been good advice, and it's worked very well for me. Go to bed knowing what your first line of the following day is going to be.
Yeah, you need that, don't you? You need that kind of motivation, as it were,
Yeah,
to know where you're going to start, and then fresh the next day, keep you going, and
yeah,
keep those ideas
exactly.
flowing. And lovely advice from a lovely man there, Terence
Yeah,
Dix. So
indeed.
I was very lucky to meet years ago at an event, and he sat down with us. He was charming.
Yes,
Such
he
a
is.
lovely man.
I used to have lunch with him and my editor quite a lot if we were
Yeah,
both in visiting BBC Books at the same time. So
yeah,
yeah, very good.
yeah. Um, so when Doctor Who came back in 2005 for that huge relaunch, as it were, um, was that an easy transition for you to get involved in that? Were you how did that happen?
Well, I was still BBC staff at the time. I mean, the effects department had been closed down, but I'd been kept on running a one-man model unit allied to the BBC's digital effects facility, mainly because we were working on a big Channel 4 documentary about alien life called Extraterrestrial that had already been pitched, and we were committed to doing it as a mix of model work and CG. So when the effects department closed, my manager there said, well, hang on a minute. We've just pitched and got this massive show, and now you've shut down the department that's going to make it. So I was there primarily to just run Extraterrestrial. So I got wind of the fact that Doctor Who was coming back. So I went to my management team and I went, I think we should pitch for this, both digital and practical effects. And they were like, okay, fine, but how do we get an in to this? And I said, well, I went to school with Russell and I've got his email address. So I literally emailed Russell and I went, hi, see that you're bringing Doctor Who back. Fantastic news. I'd love to have a chat to see what the possibilities are of us getting involved. And I got a lovely email back from him, and I had dinner with him, Phil Collinson and Julie Gardner, and they just talked about what Doctor Who coming back was going to be. And they said, by all means, please do pitch, because we are opening it out to tender across a number of different visual effects companies, because we honestly didn't know how to make Doctor Who for a modern audience. We hadn't made it for years. And so there was a formal pitching process. We were sent episodes 1 and 2, so Rose and the End of the World. Myself, a couple of the digital effects guys and our management team broke everything down into, this is how we think Doctor Who should be done. This is how we think these episodes should be broken down. And this is how much we think it's going to cost. That was submitted. And we had a formal meeting with all the production team and us. And we didn't get it. The mill got Doctor Who, not us. But I knew that the mill didn't have an in-house model making department. They were purely digital. So I trotted round to their offices with my portfolio, and I saw a gentleman called Dave Throssell, who was the head of Mill TV. And he went, yeah, he said, I think it's a fantastic idea for us to have a model supervisor on board. So I'll tell the production that we want you to come along with us to the first planning meeting. So I then had to go back to my management and go, well, I've got Doctor Who, but it's only for my bit. It's not for the digital effects bits. I'll be working effectively with the opposition, which was a bit of a political hot potato. They weren't that happy, but it was like, at the end of the day, BBC Resources was there to make money. And they said, if Mike can make money through the model work, then we're going to let him go off and chase that show. And that led to me working on Rose, Aliens of London, World War III, Dalek and the parting of the ways. So, the blowing up of the Nestine Lair, destruction of Big Ben, blowing up Downing Street, the Dalek Emperor, plus a load of little elements that we just dropped in for the mill along the way. But at that point, I'm completely in-house still. As a BBC visual effects designer working on it, just happened to be working with a non-BBC digital effects company.
Please tell me if I'm right or wrong about this. Are you still involved with it now?
I
Or
haven't worked on the show since I did one Capaldi episode, but no, I haven't been on the show for a good 6 years now.
right. Can I ask you about that Capaldi episode, please?
Please do.
What parts of that did you work on? Because a lot of it's nice to know from your perspective what model work you did on that. Obviously, that the sea creature was CGI.
Yes.
So
there's a key sequence. The Doctor and his companion Bill are standing on the frozen Thames, and the monster basically melts the ice below Bill and sucks her into the Thames. And the Doctor goes running after her. And before the ice is completely frozen over, he jumps and smashes through. And the production had explored doing that as a stunt. But the stunt man, I think, was concerned that with the heavy metal helmet that they'd had made, that as he hit the water, he would immediately upend. So they looked at doing it CG, and the CG guys went, well, there's an awful lot of dynamics to deal with here. You've got a human figure, you've got shattering ice, you've got water. So I had a phone call from Stephen Morris, who was the line producer, and he said, do you think this is something that could be achieved in miniature? And I said, yes, I'm certain it can. But we'd have to go quite big to get the water to scale properly. So I did a little bit of research, and James Cameron's film The Abyss has got a number of shots with a puppet of the actor Ed Harris in a diving suit. So I sourced some very good photographs of that puppet being made and a clip of the puppet in the film, and effectively went to them and went, if it's good enough for James Cameron, it's good enough for Doctor Who. We just need to make sure the puppet's built of similar scale, which is 1/3 of full size. And we budgeted it, and it came up that, yeah, that would work really nicely. They already had an underwater shoot scheduled. So we just said, well, we'll piggyback on the back of that. So effectively, all we really did was 2 shots. We did a shot of the camera looking up at the ice as the Doctor smashes through. And then we did a side-on shot of him drifting down through shot with bubbles trailing and hitting the floor. So 2 shots, but 2 shots they couldn't achieve any other way.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it's lovely to know that some of the little tricks behind that, Yeah. In some of these cases, Mike, from when you came back, got involved again from 2005 up to Capaldi's episode. So you were working for quite some time on it. I know a lot of the work is obviously done in a workshop. You're building models or whatever you're doing, but are there any points where you're actually on set with the working and you get to meet the team and the actors at all?
Less so these days. The classic series, very definitely, because you didn't specialize the way that modern effects companies specialize. So as well as the model work, we were doing the bangs and flashes, the explosions, the smoke, the hand props, the Doctor's gadgets. So at that point, you were meeting the cast and crew all the time. By the time the show has come back in 2005, the production has adopted a far more film-based production model, where there's a production designer, an art department, and even the effects department was split into digital effects, creature effects, practical physical effects, miniature effects. There's 4 or 5 different effects companies, and our work never needed to be done at the same time as the live action. We effectively operate as a completely separate second unit. So the closest I came to meeting the main production was on Day of the Doctor, where, because we were shooting everything with native 3D cameras, we could only film on the 2 days off where the main unit weren't using the cameras. So we had to go down to Cardiff and set up our model shoot there. So I did actually meet an awful lot of the main production team on the 50th anniversary. But normally I'm filming them in my own studio, or a studio I've booked with my own crew. And then the first time I sort of liaise with the production is when I'm handing the footage over and we're sitting down to see where the stuff can work in the edit.
Would I be right in saying that the sequence with John Hurt's TARDIS crashing through and knocking all the Daleks out was that a model?
Yes, that
That was
was
a
our big
that was shot, and
model.
you would have had like lighting and be filming it and so
Yeah.
on. Yeah.
So yeah, that was a quarter scale model TARDIS, a miniature set that was I'd worked with the art department to make sure that what we were building matched what they were doing on location. The Daleks were all rigged with pyrotechnics and to split apart. We did the big Time Lord cannon as well. So yeah, I mean that was the big sequence for the 50th.
Brilliant. Very
And
effective. But it was
yeah,
very
I mean,
effective.
lovely sequence. And then we went on, we did 3 Matt Smith stories. We did Cold War, which was the submarine episode with the Ice Warrior. We did the 50th anniversary, and then we did Matt's final episode, The Time of the Doctor, which is very similar: buildings exploding, big TARDIS sets, Daleks being destroyed. So, we
Yeah.
had a nice run of work with Matt's Doctor.
Yes, you did.
But I never got to meet him.
Ah, shame. It's a shame, isn't it? But that's the nature of the business, isn't
Yeah,
it?
nature of the business
You're
these
very
days.
much sort of in your own sort of unit,
Yeah,
basically.
exactly,
Most of
exactly.
it, as I say, is behind the scenes. So yeah, yeah. Um, so what have you got? What have you got coming up, Mike? Any projects you can talk about that you're working on, or?
Um, well, I've semi-retired. I mean, I closed the workshop during COVID, or just after COVID, the pandemic. There were, for a variety of reasons, it just made sense to get rid of a permanent workshop and a company. So I'm back as a freelance visual effects designer again, sort of gun for hire. So I've taken on the odd little job here and there, and from a sort of science fiction and Doctor Who world, I've been involved with the Blu-ray sets that the BBC are bringing out of the classic series. So sometimes it's with replacement effect sequences, and sometimes it's with the little dramas that they do as trailers for the sets coming up. So last year they were bringing out a John Pertwee series, and they did a little sequence with Katie Manning and a couple of cavers finding a baby sea devil. So I was contacted to sculpt and puppeteer the baby sea devil and the egg cracking open. So that's been really nice. I've been going back to sort of very traditional, sort of old school ways of doing things. And I can't tell you exactly which series or episode or season we're doing, but I'm currently involved in a sequence for one of the upcoming ones for next year, revisiting some old techniques from my time on the show back in the 80s. So it's been lovely.
And it's really nice to know that. Yeah, that's lovely. I remember that sequence about with the little egg at the sea devil egg was great. Yeah. Um, I love those little trailers they've been doing.
Yeah,
You know,
they've been
that
lovely, and I've wanted to work on one for a while, so that was a lovely one to do.
was yeah. Um, Mike, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate this very much. It's
Not at all.
been really nice. It has been great, and thank you everyone for watching too. And we should be back with another interview very soon, of course, to talk more Doctor Who. Until then, guys, take care, and we'll see you all soon.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, Frank.
Bye.